So I'm delighted to be here. I'm really looking forward to having more conversations with folks today. I'm doing a bit of a different talk, more kind of at a meta level, kind of about doing research papers in computing, particularly in HCI and Computer Vision. And what I'm kind of hoping you might come away from this talk is maybe being a little bit inspired to try experimenting in how you do research papers, how you write them. Okay, John Van Manen, who's a prominent organizational science scholar, has done a lot of wonderful ethnographies of companies, wrote a really great paper about styles theory, and he says, we cultivate and teach a writing style of non-style that values limited metaphor, simplicity, and a formal, if not mathematical, precision. Much of our writing is washed by a thick spray of claimed objectivity, since artful delights and forms are seen by many, if not most writers and readers in the field to interfere with the presentation of what's actually there in a given social world. So Van Manen goes on to describe certain ways of what we typically look for in research papers, and particularly, I would say, in qualitative papers, right? Clarity of argument, you want it elegant, keep to the essentials, unadorned, showing deep analysis, spare in some points. And especially in HCI, I think we think about, are we doing the right theoretical claims? Or maybe do we have implications for designs? Perhaps some sensitizing concepts. So I want to just talk about what does a qualitative paper look at HCI, and rather than try to critique someone else's paper, I'll just kind of just look at my own papers. And I think this maybe is I wouldn't say it's an exemplar, but maybe it's a common style that wouldn't be out of the norms in writing qualitative papers, right? So, I think everyone knows the basic structure, or many of you know there's an abstract, introduction, related work, talking about methods. And then, in the findings sections, typically they come from maybe from some grounded theory analysis, coding, doing some memoing, and then that forms the genesis of certain sections. You can describe them as themes. So this was a study on Irish pubs and the use of smartphones, using interviews and observations. And so one of the findings from the codings with the team was about how people lose authentic banter in the pub, and the mobile phone kind of presents that back and forth authentic banter. And then we have a quote here talking about the ebb and flow of conversations, and how even though there's a fact they're discussing, they could look up on smartphone, they're saying, I'd rather we not look at the smartphone and interrupt the flow and keep the conversation going. And then if you have people with phones and without phones, then it creates kind of the have-nots and have phones, and then people get left out. Okay, so this is kind of one of the finding sections. And then at the end, you might have sort of a discussion, sort of design implications section, right? So here we're kind of thinking about, well, the Irish pub is a third space, but it's becoming kind of a surveilled space with the smartphone. And so how might we limit the surveilling in this space? Reconfiguring the pub space might be one sort of design implications, making mobile-only areas, smartphone limiters. Maybe we're thinking about if during trivia games in the pubs, which are popular, make the answers more ambiguous, not just have one answer, etc. Okay, so this is kind of one way, I think, not too uncommon about doing reporting and disseminating sort of qualitative research. And so maybe we can shift gears and think about what's a different way to talk about qualitative work, right? And so I want to switch to a book written by Kathleen Stewart, an anthropologist. She wrote a book called Ordinary Affects that kind of talks about experiences of American culture broadly, okay? And in her introduction, she says, the book tries to slow the quick jump to representational thinking and evaluative critique long enough to find ways of approaching the complex and uncertain objects that fascinate because they literally hit us or exert a pull on us. Okay, so stick with me here. My effort is to find something to say about ordinary affects by performing some of the intensity and texture that makes them habitable and animate. Ordinary affects is written as an assemblage of disparate scenes. Each scene begins anew the approach to the ordinary form, an angle set off by the scene's affects. Okay, so Kathleen Stewart adopts sort of an affect theory approach, and through her writing, she's trying to capture some of that affect and emotion, and the fact that you can't always, when you have a feeling, you can't always pinpoint it, right? And sometimes you can't even label the feeling you're having. Sometimes the feeling comes in with some uncertainty, it comes with a shock. These are kind of these aspects that are kind of hazy that she wants to convey through written word, okay? So I'll give an example of one of the scenes in the book, okay? So the book has a preface, but then it has a number of scenes of varying lengths, right? And some of them are a couple pages or 2 paragraphs, some of them are just 1 paragraph. This one is called PMS Powered. It begins, ordinary scenes can tempt the passerby with the promise of a story let out of the bag. Matter can shimmer with undetermined potential and the weight of received meaning. One day, she's walking through the gated community of Irvine, California, where, as some who can't afford to live there say, all the trash cans sit on doilies and all the weeds grow in perfect rows. I did my PhD, so I can attest to that. She comes across a late model fire engine red Ford sedan parked at the curb on a cul-de-sac. Sprawled across the driver's doors are the words PMS Powered. A snazzy car with an in-your-face attitude, it backtalks the social snickering of PMS jokes. She imagines the car driving around town as the moving scene of an attitude adjustment. But when she walks around the car, she sees that both tires on the side are missing. The car is actually listing on one hastily placed jack left either by thieves in a hurry or by the harried car owner in the middle of a compound problem. Now the car becomes another kind of thing, more complicated. Perched on the unpredictable or unimagined edge of the ordinary, it takes on the full charge of potentials, 2 twisted poles, up or down, one thing or another. It sparks in the tension between drudgery and routine, the barely holding on and the flash of event. Okay? Here's another excerpt, just 2 sentences called Hardwired. We take our cues so directly from circulating forces that the term hardwired has become shorthand for the state of things. Little undulations are felt as pleasures and warning signs, as intoxications and repetitions in daily routine. Okay, so, I think everyone will have a different reaction to these sort of scenes. So, but just think about, what's the reaction you had? Does it convey affect? I think just keep those in the back of your mind. So after she published this book, I think it caused a bit of a stir. And so there was sort of a author meets critics article published where some scholars wrote about their reaction to the work. And then Kathleen Stewart replied back. So one person said, it is a book that works best when you immerse yourself in it, when you let it affect you rather than trying to pin it down and force it to make sense. I keep returning to it as an effective rendering of ordinary life and common American culture. Attending to affect dispels the insistence for intellectual comprehension and allows the visceral to come to its own ordinary surfacing, unburned by the weight of theoretical representation. Okay, so I think these kind of encapsulate notions of that her writing is tentative, speculative, and kind of relies on you as a reader to do some heavy lifting, right? So Kathleen Stewart said that she wrote the book to incite new forms of writing and reading, new approaches to analytic objects, and new forms of attention attachment to the intensities and sensibilities now taking place in the various situations of the ordinary. So the book is an experiment in ethnography. Okay, so I really like this book. Lily was the one who first recommended it to me, so I looked it over to think about how to write qualitative work, especially with emotions. So what happened was there was a book being made about the HCI outdoors with Scott McCrickard, Michael Jones, and Tim Stelter, and they invited me to write a chapter. So I thought maybe I can try to write something in this style for an HCI audience. It's an invited chapter, so I can experiment a little bit, less of a risk to do it as well. Okay, so because I've been recently interested in rural computing, and I was trying to understand what does it mean to be rural, and is it rural just a place? Is it a feeling? And this kind of chapter kind of captures some of my thoughts about that. And part of it is because I could draw from my own experience. I grew up in San Martin, California. Anyone know where that is? San Martin, California? Okay. Oh, hey. Yeah. So you just drive about an hour, 15 minutes maybe with no traffic, right? Past Morgan Hill, and it's in between Morgan Hill and Gilroy. And so it's a small unincorporated city. And I don't know when I was growing up there, but it's considered a rural area, right? So then I wrote some scenes in Kathleen Stewart's style, talking about affective infrastructures, for example. So in my family's backyard, they do have a barn, but when they bought the place, they did not put animals in it. They used it as a car garage. And then I also wrote an excerpt talking about the internet infrastructure there. So I'll just read some small part of it. So every time he goes home, he expects it. Web pages load at a crawling pace, so much so that he notices the order in which text and images download and display starting from the upper left. His dad shows him flyers from Vyasta, exclaiming service alert for speeds up to 10 times faster than typical DSL at his address. The flyer has a photo of country homes with spacious land, lush trees, and cute sheds, all bathed in rays of sunlight. Presumably, Viasat is the beacon of hope for the rural. He sees that it's satellite service, $50 for the first 3 months, but increases to $70 afterwards. Sigh, what a ripoff. He feels trapped, and the companies know it too, the desperation in the air. And then I also posted a picture of if you drive by a road by my parents' house, there's a telephone post or whatever with all these signs, many of them stapled on about getting new internet access. I also wrote about my experiences in Indiana, talking about doing field work with hunters. So I did some studies about the use of technology by hunters and issues of fairness in technology. And this one depicts a scene where I went to Starbucks to meet an informant at a town that has a history with KKK and racism, actually. But in that interaction, I talked about ordering at Starbucks, and I asked the person what he wanted. I said, my treat. And then Peter looked up and was overwhelmed by coffee choices and lingo, tall, grande, flat white, etc. Scratching his head, Peter asked if they had hot chocolate. He was bemused, that's me, that Peter didn't know how to order at Starbucks. But then looking back, he wondered why he was bemused. He's ashamed. When he first started drinking coffee, he was confused by the choices. Of course, Starbucks is its own country with strange words like frappuccino and venti. He should look at his own consumerist Generation X commodification, having become a citizen of Starbucks International. Okay, so this is kind of talking about my own biases when talking to some of the rural populations. Okay, so I wrote this chapter with a whole bunch of these different scenes, right? And I didn't put a discussion section. I had a very short intro. And then what the editors did, which I appreciated, was that they sent the draft chapters to their students in their classes, like CS students, and asked them, okay, it's your job you guys are presenting it, and then you're going to have some people in the audience. You have to lead a discussion about this chapter. So these are some of the reactions from the students. They kind of compiled it for me. They said, first, it's fun, but it gets tiresome. The chapter with its length, the organization took several readings to make sense. It was after a half dozen reads and one convincing team member that the presenters decided to own this new form of writing, dive into it. One commented that the writing grew on us, but like fungus, right? Some students, the ones who didn't have to lead it, they were pleased that they just had to read some vignettes as standalone text without having to connect them to other vignettes and without the aim of drawing some meaningful conclusions or discernment. The presenters went through stages of dismissal, frustration, infuriation, to persuasion. And then, some of the students wanted some kind of hand-holding, might have gone the readers farther down the trail. Perhaps something even less than hand-holding would have sufficed. Just watching a friend jump the ditch can reassure one that is possible and worthwhile. Okay, so as a result of this feedback, I did write a section kind of about the motivation of writing this work. Talking about ethnography and HCI, kind of the spiel I gave at the beginning. And then I kind of talked about like how I might interpret it as thinking about ruralities as something more to be performed and everywhere in the bodily experiences about that. And then also encouraging the reader to come up with their own interpretation, not necessarily my own. Okay, so we did try a more radical format, adopting Kathleen Stewart's seeing what the CS students' reactions were, and then I took some of that feedback. And then at that same time, the paper that Michael was referring to, Lily and Amanda and I, Amanda Lazar, we're kind of thinking about external critique specifically and how that affects tech workers in companies. So we want to know how things like Techlash affected the lives of tech workers inside their organizations and outside, and what are the emotions that they're feeling. And so we thought that trying to use Kathleen Stewart's writing style might be appropriate for this because it really is about the emotions, and we want to also foreground each story. So I think a tension I often feel when writing qualitative work is that to some extent you have to reduce what people are saying, right? You're gonna have to choose quotes judiciously to make your point, and you lose some of the narrative that they're telling you, and you're kind of weaving into your own narrative. So we want to really foreground their own stories without necessarily inserting ourselves in too much in the text. So we did semi-structured interviews with tech workers about external critique they received. They sketched the experience, and then we also asked them to modify the sketch on how they would like the experience to change. So this person's talking, I think, to his brother and saying, how do you feel about destroying democracy? And then he wanted corrected to say, hey, I heard about this about your company. What's that about? He rather that be the discussion. Okay, once I got the empirical data from that using traditional methods of inquiry in qualitative work, then we converted them to scenes just like Kathleen Stewart, okay? So this is kind of a long test. I won't go through the whole thing, but this is the bare text of the interview itself and describes a scene in a subway where the person has their headphones on, right? And they look over, they see someone moving their mouth towards you, and they're saying something and they look kind of angry. So I say, excuse me? And then they say it and you hear it and it kind of blindsides you at first because it's like, I don't even know you. So many things are going through my head. First, I don't know you. Two, what are you talking about? And then three, once you realize what they're talking about, which is a critique of their company, it's like, okay, that's why. I'm trying to piece together a puzzle in a split couple of seconds on the subway before I even respond because I'm trying to figure out who this person is, what they want, where they're coming from. And then once you figure out, it's like I just put my headphones back on and I turned away and kept going. And my inner thought is, here we go again, this type of thought because I've dealt with it at Koala, pseudonym of the company. And what I mean by this is misinformation. We talk about people feeling the need when they feel like they can be masked and disguised or they can't see. You can't point them out because they're being backed up or validated by the masses. So it's like groupthink. And we talked about that there's a feeling, the need to critique someone just because they're wearing the logo, the company logo. You don't really know their affiliation, right? It's almost easier for me to yell at a human than to yell at an idea of a company. Okay, so based on that, that's just one extra part of that interview, but we took other excerpts from the interview as well, where the participant talked about their own background and identity, a first-generation Caribbean immigrant, and sort of the racism that they kind of faced as well, and how they, kind of grew a thicker skin as a result, and in some sense prepared them for some of these experiences, right? So in this case, we converted it here, and then we described it in terms of Dakota's viewpoint, right? Is on the subway, minding his business, listening to music with his headphones, a first-generation Caribbean immigrant. He had grown up hyper-visible as the only person of color in his town. But this is a new thing. He turns to see something out of the corner of his eye. It seethes with anger. He tries to ignore it, but hovers about, buzzing at him. Their mouths move, grumbling for attention, speaking in sort of peanuts-like dialect, wah-wah, angrily. Pulling out the headphones, he says, excuse me. Then they say it, and he realizes the scarlet letter drew them in. Like many tech workers, Dakota got company swag, a bag probably displaying Koala's emblem. He calls it a scarlet letter. So many things are spinning through his head. He's trying to piece together a puzzle in a split couple of seconds before he can even respond. Who is this person? What do they want? Where are they coming from? Nonetheless, he's numb to the deja vu of hypervisibility. Here we go again. Once he figures out what they're going to do, he turns away and keeps going. Later, he took a black marker and actually scratched out the bag's logo. It wasn't enough. He removed the stitches. You could still see that. And then he eventually used another bag. So that comes from another part of the interview as well. Okay, so that's the conversion of this to sort of a scene, and we did it all kind of as a group together. And in the paper also, we were very careful to kind of describe, how are we designing the paper itself, right? And these are kind of minute details, but it's different from Kathleen Stewart's writing a little bit, because we did actually put in subsections and different themes and organize the quotes in different ways. But we still want to be sure to separate the researcher's voice from the scenes that the participants described, right? So, and then we use a little symbol there. It's called a fleuron, apparently. That's an old style thing that's used in books as a separator from the researcher's voices and the scenes. And so, we talked a lot about how to symbolize this. We thought, can we add text that says, okay, now we're going to switch to the person, the participant, but we didn't want the additional text to remove away from the story itself. And we thought the symbolic meaning would be better to transition. Okay, so the way the writing work was, so we had the transcripts. We did do sort of the traditional qualitative kind of coding of the qualitative research. And then those kind of serve, if you like, as sensitizing concepts as we develop the scenes. And then from the scenes, we also mapped out a narrative, connecting some scenes together and grouping them together. And then we did member checking. We sent back all the scenes back to the participants and the narrative to ask them to verify what they thought about that. I think there was only one correction that was more a factual change. Okay, and then we did have, a discussion section about one way to interpret the results, which is talking about the emotional habitus of tech work, right? So the scenes we're saying kind of represent overall what is the prevailing way to feel and act in tech companies, right? And this kind of prevailing way to act will orient you to certain political action in actions. It doesn't control you like a robot, but it definitely orients you and suggests what you can and cannot do in a company. And one of the things that often suggests is that you should try to be rational, have technological hope, do constructive criticisms only, and kind of embrace technological solutionism. Other kind of feelings which are more unusual in companies were not really in this emotional habitus. To feel anger or sadness or fear in a tech company was unusual. So it kind of closed off certain actions which could happen with the workers, right? But the Techlash kind of opened things up where workers now did feel these feelings of companies that used to be, a big deal to work at, but now people were critiquing them. And so because they couldn't feel the way they wanted to these companies, they would seek out other spaces like, maybe like the Tech Workers Coalition or online forums. Okay, and this diagram from the cover slide, it kind of represents like how we kind of did the narrative, the messiness in it. So at some point we actually cut up all the scenes in paper and we scanned it, and then we used a Miro board and we were playing around with the narrative and seeing what would kind of convey the thoughts the best over there. Okay, so just a few things about this paper. Initially, I wanted to have like no discussion section at all, like we thought. But then I was talking to my collaborators, but they're saying, okay, you just can't do that. You need to give a little hand-holding. So we did that, but we tried to make it clear that that was one interpretation, and we kind of invited readers to come up with their own kind of discussion section based on the scenes. I'm not sure if that was entirely successful or not. Okay, so I kind of talked about a little bit about pushing boundaries of papers. So I talked about, just an example of what is HCI qual work right now, and then trying to think about adopting a more radical style, adopting Kathleen Stewart's way of using empirical work with a chapter. And then finally, maybe being a little bit more conservative compared to the HCI outdoors chapter and publishing at CSCW here, okay? So I want to now make a little shift of kind of doing the same things about looking at computer vision papers, okay? But I think first, we want to talk a little about what is a computer vision paper too. So we've done some recent research looking into doing a media archaeology approach of CVPR papers. So this was work done with Sam Gorey, Gabe Appleby, and David Crandall. And so we went through all the CVR papers from 2013, 2021, and then Sam actually did interviews with veteran computer vision researchers at the conference as well to ask them about changes in the paper format for computer vision. And the basic premise is you think papers are designed social and cultural interface created by disciplines and creating scientific truth, right? So, what's changing and what does that change signal overall about the discipline? Okay, so I'm just going to talk about a few of the high-level findings. More of the point is to just talk about what is a computer vision paper now. A lot of it is about advertising, we argue, right? So teaser images are a big part of computer vision papers, right? So you can see here in this plot here about, the percentage of papers that have at least one teaser figure has been rising astronomically. And then we also, a teaser is just like, showing oftentimes many different algorithms and models attempting to solve the same problem, but they depict it in such a way, obviously, that their approach will be the best here. So here's wireframe detection, and then theirs is at the end, ours, which is doing the best, right? And then you can try kind of an analogy of like, Sam found a good example of like Bounty paper towels, and then they do a demonstration. Here's one that breaks up easily, and here's one that's strong and still has its structure, okay? Another part that's a big part about computer vision papers is the tables of results, okay? Measuring contribution, tables of results are a big part of it. I think it's tempting to just think of them as textual content, but the effect on the paper, we argue, is partly visual, right? So tables visually represent state of the art, often with respect to, top 1 accuracy on ImageNet test sets for image classification, or for average precision on test sets for object detection, right? And then the best results, usually the authors are in bold in these tables inevitably, right? So the design feature is essentially for readability, because these large tables are hard to read, difficult to interpret it. And it should be noted that computer vision papers were not always about tables of results, right? So in the 80s or 90s, a lot of the papers relied on mathematical arguments based on pinhole camera geometry. They had no quant results. Empirical results evaluation included at all was primarily qualitative, or they would just show you, hey, we made this image, or these are things detected, it looks pretty good, right? And they just show the image there, right? Showing some samples. And so this represents a transition of computer vision from an applied math discipline to a quantitative empirical one. So as vision became reliant on empirical evaluation, it adopted tables of results, right? And that results table also comes from, I think, borrowed from runtime benchmarking computer graphics as a discipline as well over there. Okay, so as evaluation benchmarks became established for vision problems, tables grew in size and importance, right? And competition on benchmarks is an organizing principle of the discipline, arguably, right? So I think this quote is great. It talks about if it's an established benchmark, there's like somebody who has the lead, just like you would have in a classic video game arcade machine, right? You have to have your initials at the top with the top score. That's what they're doing, and that's what's frustrating, right? And then you can see the fraction of CVPR papers with figures and tables over time, and the average number of figures and tables per paper over time as well is increasing. Okay, and another thing is I think right now, some of us cling on to paper, but the PDF paper, especially in Vision, is now viewed as a screen-based format. There's some of the older researchers talked about that, they enjoy the photocopying from the proceedings. I remember when I used to do that sometimes, and then there's a preciousness to the paper that you have there and you might go back to it, right? But now it's a screen-based format, and I think this is kind of reflected in the PDF format using scale, the vector images. So a lot of the papers will have images like this, which if you print it out are completely illegible, and even at a normal scale on the monitor, if you show the whole paper, is hard to read. So you have to zoom into the image to actually see the details, to look at them. So this is an example of one image, and then here's some other examples of different highly information-dense figures. These help bend the conference limits. You can fit the images in, they're visually appealing, and if you want to see details, you zoom in. That's the PDF format there. Okay, so the overall argument, we kind of make this about what is a computer vision paper. It's a lot about attention, right? And it reflects an attention economy. Contributions of paper reduced to its exchange value in terms of the attention it generates. And authors leverage early attention to increase prestige values of papers. So this obviously is like posting papers on archive, getting feedback there, putting it in front of more eyes and increasing chances to reach the right audience through social media posts. And all this attention, as attested in many of the interviews in the paper, talk about that these lead to more citations, job opportunities, students, and even grants. So I encourage you to look at the paper in more detail. There's a more extended discussion also of the effects of archive as well. Okay, so that's kind of the standard of computer vision papers right now, and it's about grabbing attention. It has certain hallmarks in its style. And so I kind of want to shift on saying, okay, one thing we want to do, again, looking at emotions, again, was saying, can we publish a purely qualitative paper in computer vision? That was one of the challenges. I was talking to David one day. And then because we have been talking about what is the emotional impact of the explosive growth of computer vision, right? So to do this work, we actually collected 56 stories from the computer vision community. And this was in the height of the pandemic. So we used a sort of a writing prompt in a Google Doc format. So the participants would be guided to a Google Doc, and on top would say, please write down a nonfiction story, at least 2 paragraphs, involving yourself as the main character. Story should depict a real concrete event, involve computer vision or machine learning, involve recent changes in those disciplines, should have an emotional impact, be memorable, and should be relatively self-contained. So it doesn't need some kind of other external document to understand. Okay, and then we also gave some helpful hints. Maybe like in how do you write a good story? Maybe have a dramatic element. You can experiment with your writing style. You can put dialogue. You can try to think of a plot, a progressive plot, establishing setting conflict, rising to a climax, and wrapping up with loose ends. Okay, so in a way, we try to emulate a little bit of the semi-structured interview format. So people would write down the stories, and then David and I would go in and comment using the Google comment feature. And then we'd ask them to respond to our comments on the Google Doc. And sometimes what happened, they would reply back or they would iterate on the story. And I was not sure how many people would do this, but I was surprised that we got actually a lot of people filling out the stories and wanting to tell their experiences with computer vision's growth. So I think, the stories were creative, powerful, full of panache, and some of them were very short and some of them were very long. I think the longest one was like 6 pages long, okay? So I'll just describe kind of one story here. This person says, they don't know deep learning would be the next big thing. I don't know deep learning would be the next big thing. I pored over what materials were available and told everyone in my lab about convolutional neural networks and why I thought they were a promising approach. As more results were published, I started giving talks more broadly to other researchers on campus. Everyone I got to talk about some of my early work at a workshop during the CVPR conference. I was doing things I wanted and people liked it. People liked me for it. And then at CVPR 2014, you would put deep in the title of your paper to attract the attention of people interested in that sort of things. As the years of what eventually became my PhD went on, it was no longer possible. If someone said, I'm working on deep learning, response might be right, but what are you actually doing with it, right? And then neural networks just became a toolbox that everyone's familiar with. What was I working on? Not deep learning. My PhD saw a fair amount of success, but also a lot of inevitable failure, especially during the middle years when deep learning was transitioning from a niche to a ubiquitous tool. I felt bad about it, consumed by failure, as many PhD students do. But sitting behind these research failures was, I suppose, it was an identity that had been stolen from me. What was I working on? Deep learning, but clearly I needed a different answer to that question. I don't think I ever found a different answer to the question. Perhaps I never will. Apparently, you don't need an answer to that question to get a PhD. What did change is that the question does not define me in the way it did before. I'm a person, I'm a researcher. I'm not a deep learning researcher, though I do still have a penchant for using deep learning. That's enough for now. Whatever is next is next. This one was I think quite a creative one about, before I got serious about this, I had been a simple, happy nerd pushing boundaries on the next computer vision technology. But that juncture, I was getting to my 30s, beginning to look outside my ivory tower with more awareness of social responsibilities, and kind of feeling like going back to college and graduate school application days, facing the upcoming new beginning. I had scratched my head to think of the personal statement for my next step in life. It reminded me of the famous Hindu scripture quote by Oppenheimer after witnessing the first detonation of the nuclear weapon. Now I'm becoming death, the destroyer of worlds. All the questions about ethics and necessary evil came back. I can't pretend to be an ostrich researcher, hiding my head in the sand and blame others for the misuse of technology. Okay, so I think these stories, you see some narratives, some kind of clever metaphors being used as well. So I think, in this sense, the method worked to kind of extract sort of interesting emotional stories. Okay, so what did we do with these findings then? Okay, so we had discussed maybe we can do a Kathleen Stewart kind of thing, but we decided to take a more conventional HCI approach, yet still, I guess, relatively radical for CVPR, right? So we did signal in the paper. So David wrote this paragraph because he's a computer vision scientist, and he said, he wrote the intro sentence here is, we are well aware this is not a typical CVPR paper. We beat no benchmarks. We introduce no data sets. We present no novel loss functions. Okay, so we wrote that, and then we did, what might be pretty normal in HCI works. We did constructivist grounded theory approach, analyze. We had finding sections, prose interlead with selected quotes. I would say, especially for this paper, due to the need that we felt to take a more conservative approach compared to Kathleen Stewart, I did feel disappointed we couldn't better present the raw stories. There's definitely a lot missing, and I think we're trying to think about how we can do better to represent the full stories. Okay, so we got the reviews back from CVPR, and I think we got lucky. I think luck plays a lot of role in some of these papers. And the readers, some of them seem intrigued by it. And we got some comments about, the sample size and the need for quantitative results, right? And so we wrote a rebuttal, right? And then in the rebuttal, we basically said, okay, how do we fit within a couple of paragraphs what is qualitative research and how is it different from quantitative research, right? So this is actually a really great book, Salsa Dancing into Social Sciences. I think it explains very well the thinking behind when you approach qualitative research and how it is different than quantitative thinking, which is for many people kind of the default, especially with the scientific method that you're taught. So we kind of drew from this book. We talked about how quantitative approaches verify a priori hypotheses. It's not always, I realize, but this is kind of summarizing. Qualitative approaches seek to discover relevant categories. Sampling, we want to find a reasonable representative sample for the larger phenomenon. We're not claiming to represent the whole population. And then we talk about saturation here. Okay, and then we submitted a rebuttal, and the paper got in. And I don't think Twitter is the right way to measure impact of the paper, but not many of my papers get on Twitter, but this was one case it did, and I think it's because of the novelty of the work itself, right? So the CVPR Twitter account itself talked about the paper, and it talked about that it's important to read this because it talks about changes in the community and the challenges, right? And then we got, I think it's interesting to see what people write about papers on Twitter. So Walter Schreier, who plays a big role in the CVPR community, he wrote about the paper, but it's great that he kind of picked out quotes that resonated with him, right? And I think that's an interesting way to kind of talk about a paper. And then he said, it's not surprising that there's this much negative sentiment behind the scenes. And what can we do to create a more positive experience for everyone, right? We'd make a lot more progress if we were happier in our work. And then, some people are, I think, making some cheeky kind of jokes off this. I equate what many senior people went through as deep learning took over with the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. So denial, don't worry, deep learning won't solve everything. Anger, oh crap, it will solve everything. Bargaining, I'll keep doing what I was doing, but add a little bit of DL. And then acceptance, check out my new DL paper in CVPR. And someone said, you forgot the depression part. It's like, I'm all washed up, my career is over, everything I've done is now worthless. And then he's like, I'm okay, guys, right? And then, people commented, there are a lot of comments about the feeling that a lot of computer vision folks enter the field to learn something more foundational about how we see and perceive the world, but we end up becoming more like neural network technicians, right? Fine-tuning parameters, et cetera, right? So I think that resonated with a lot of folks. And this person that was kind of an oddly intense read. And I think I like this tweet also because in the end, it talks a little bit how it's hard to voice these feelings, right? And I think that's precisely the point, that emotions are a hard thing to convey in these works and sometimes call for different methods to convey them. And I think this person realizes that there about the emotions of doing computer vision. Okay, so I talked about, kind of pushing boundaries with HCI works, right? What is a HCI qual paper? Doing something a little more radical, dialing a little bit back, but talking about Techlash and tech workers, right? Still adopting these formats. And then talking about what's the current format of computer vision papers, and then trying to do something radically different, right? And for that community, at least, right? With a purely qualitative paper. Incidentally, I think Sam, he collected all the CVPR papers, and he told me that he could see all the file sizes of papers, and ours is the CVPR paper that is the smallest file size out of all the papers. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, I think, maybe this will give you some ideas on your own about thinking about writing style and pushing boundaries. And in this context, it worked well, I think, because we're talking about emotions, right? And that kind of suggested to us maybe a different style of writing or conveyance. Okay, so how might we further push boundaries? So let's talk a little bit about some ideas we had that we just never did. So, when we wrote the Techlash paper, I really want to say, like, okay, I really want people to come up with their own ideas based on the scenes. Can we, force people to fold the paper, like print out a dotted line and say, fold it over here while you're reading the paper, right? We kind of nixed that idea, right? Or can you put things where they'll cut up the paper instructions, so they print out the paper and they have to cut it out as well, right? So these are all attempts to kind of remove and delay discussion sections to encourage readers' conclusions of the data, right? Also, we kind of thought, okay, if you make something like have people read choose your own adventure books. So, you'll read a story and the story will come to a fork and says like, I'm going to enter the time machine, or I decide not to. If you go to the time machine, go to page 50. If you don't, go to page 10, right? So there's all these forks. So we thought, is there a way to make the paper like a choose your own adventure paper so you can understand the different decisions tech workers made, right? About thinking about their own values, what they're willing to fight for, the different forks, and can you make that into a paper, right? I'm not sure how you would do that. Other things I think should be considered is like, there's other inspirations for empirical plus humanistic kind of approaches, right? So there was a movement a while back called New Journalism that kind of made the boundaries between nonfiction and fiction kind of hazy. They would adopt the writing styles, like Gonzo writing style or different kinds of writing styles to convey journalistic articles. There's also a genre called creative nonfiction as well. Okay, so you can go to our lab's website, the Authentic User Experience Lab, to see the papers. Just a few takeaways, reflecting on norms of writing in HCI and computer vision. I think we're all taught ways of writing papers for good reason, because they work in conveying things in an effective way and showing what is valuable what is the value of your paper to readers. But it's also maybe just useful to step back and critically think about what might be lost by doing that. I talked about conveying affect through qualitative papers and doing different sort of strategies for HCI and computer vision. Overall, I think one of the goals is to give the reader more agency to interpret, thinking of the paper as an active document that you might go back in, and every time someone else reads it, they come up with their own conclusions, right? So trying to remove authority from the writer. I think more work needs to be done to examine the impact of such work. I don't think looking at tweets is a good thing. So, if we give these papers to UX professionals and sit them down, is that going to be something that affects them more than a traditional kind of qualitative paper? Right? I think that would be a good thing to look at. Does this have a greater impact beyond academia? And I think it's worth just thinking, maybe you all have thoughts about trying to experiment with your own writing for HCI papers. Another thing I do want to acknowledge is that, for example, with the CVPR paper, both David and I had tenure at that time. So we could afford to kind of experiment with these things. So I think there's kind of a risk-benefit kind of thing, calculation that's sometimes done. If you want to, how much do you want to do something experimental at the risk of your paper getting R2'd. Okay? Okay, thanks. That's all.
Thank you. I love this talk. I have so many questions, but maybe I'll start with one of them.
Yeah.
It's really interesting the way you do this work, right? You're like both making a contribution in terms of the content that you're contributing, as well as this method's contribution of like how to write a paper. And I'm curious, to what extent do you think people take away one versus the other versus both?
That's a good question. I think, it really depends on the reader. Like sometimes we get comments about they really love the writing style. They might want to try it, right? But usually the two are intertwined, right? So I think when people are giving comments, they're saying that it's good to hear the stories of the emotional impact of Techlash, right? Or the emotional impact of computer vision, right? And the method allows you to convey that. Whether they will adopt the actual style or not, I'm not sure about it, right? I've talked to some researchers where they've adopted the style and tried to do it, but sometimes it doesn't work, right, with the reviewers, right? And writing a paper on tracking personal informatics and trying to take an emotional perspective on it too, and I think that has been a hard one to get reviewers on board with the writing style as well, right? So I think there's a lot of labor involved in being upfront in the paper about the method, and you have to take up space with that. So I think that's also a balancing act as well. Yeah.
So you feel like there might be a need for a method, like a paper that talks about this meta approach to writing a paper, right? Because I don't know, I feel like it's harder. And you talked about that risk. I think it's hard for you to both try and convince someone of your argument and of your methods for writing that argument.
Yeah.
And oftentimes people are expecting you to refer, why are you doing this method? And it's harder to point at this paper and be like, we're doing this in the style of that paper versus we're doing this in the style proposed as a method in this other paper.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the paper, we make clear that there's two contributions, which is the method and the writing, right? But I think it's sometimes, it's hard to write a paper that has more than one clear overarching contribution sometimes, right? So it kind of make both, if you do try to do two at the same time, it can make both of them weaker maybe in some sense, right? So maybe it is worth, maybe writing a method kind of thing. And that's something we've been discussing too. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the comment and question. Yeah. Yes.
When I read your talk abstract, I think I came into with an expectation of we're going to be talking about innovative ways I can transform a paper I've already written into new media to make it more accessible.
Right.
The tutorial or more interactive things.
Yes.
This kind of it was way more conceptually interesting than that. But I was kind of curious if we were going beyond a paper or paper form itself. And just think of interactive media.
Yeah.
Have you kind of drawn from ideas there, have brainstormed with that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I looked at some of the past talks here. I know there's a talk about papers and making them more interactive when the speaker's here as well. So yeah, I think this talk is talking about within the constraints of the current kind of PDF format, right? But I think even that hasn't been exhausted, obviously, right? Because people have been innovating writing for a long time, right? In different writing styles to convey things, right? So like, Kathleen Stewart didn't make a new media thing. She wrote a book, but she did it in a different way. So I think we haven't even exhausted the writing styles with just writing in general, right? So I think, but it is interesting to think about, like, you know, if we are moving to more web HTML or the TAPS process in ACM, right, where things are all becoming web pages, then maybe, you know, that process translates a PDF to a web page, but it's interesting to think about how that constrains the possibilities as well through that process, right? But yeah, I think the two go hand in hand, but I think it's worth thinking about, yeah, what kind of inspiration we can take from other kinds of writing styles that already exist. Yeah, but that's a good point, yeah. Yeah, hi.
Yeah, I love that you're developing new methods here. I think the fundamental challenge for me as I look at it is this idea of giving the reader more agency. And to me, that alters the cost function of reading the paper in the sense that I have a much higher cost of coming to any conclusion, and I have a much higher risk that the value I derive is going to be worthy of that effort, so that some people may get lucky and get a lot of value, and others may get unlucky and get a low value even at the high cost.
Yeah.
And so it's risky to invest in reading your paper versus another paper with a more clear sort of story, you know, that I can gather right from the abstract. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, maybe by writing this style, I'm kind of hoping there will be some readers that are willing to invest time in reading it and rereading it and coming back. And you might have to be comfortable with the possibility that you'll lose some readers too, right? That won't have the time to do that, right? And arguably, there's more of those kind of readers when we talk about like the CVR. When we did the analysis of the computer vision papers, they're all trying to grab attention, right, from readers, right, because they don't have the patience to maybe look at beautiful prose. They want to see the images and get an instant sort of gestalt of what the paper is about, right? And so, you know, I think these are overall questions about, you know, reading, the number of papers that are out there now. What kind of experience do you want the reader to have with an academic paper, right? Is it just a one-off thing? Should it be things where they have to work to read it, right? But yeah, there's definitely a cost function there, yeah. And I think you put it well. Yeah, am I
I'll just jump in.
Okay.
I'm also choosing. Well, first, I mean, if it were just about cost functions, then like William Faulkner would, like, no one would ever read it. Like, you know, Sound and the Fury is like, you know, a novel that is worth reading, but it's not an easy novel, right? And I guess it sort of has to be worth its weight at some level. So I think there's a trade-off there that we have to negotiate. I would, during the first half of your talk, I kept reflecting back on, you know, what was maybe a decade prior, like Paul's work on implications for design, where, you know, the entire argument was essentially stop expecting that, you know, this is not just a field trip to tell you what happened. You're trying to sort of layer some kind of understanding here.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to, maybe I shouldn't, but I'm trying to glue the two arguments together at, you know, where one ends and another starts.
Yeah.
You pick up with a point of view that makes a lot of sense, which is like, if you're trying to convey affect, then stories are the right way to convey affect. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think about where there are other sort of theoretical goals you would have, where else this kind of a strategy might be the right method to apply, right?
Yeah.
Something where emotion is not the main thing you're trying to convey, but nevertheless, you know, narrative is actually the right way to get it across.
Yeah. So are you asking draw connections or?
I think I'm just curious what other kinds of goals aside from conveying affect might this be a good fit for? So for example, I got the sense, I'm sorry, her name was Kathleen Stewart, thank you. It was like also maybe appropriate for like conveying the mundane.
Yeah.
Or something. I'm just trying to think through like what are the right, which song should be played by this instrument is the way to ask.
Yeah. And like I'm just spitballing here, but like a lot of the early ubiquitous computing work, they talked about unremarkable computing, right? So a lot of the ethnomethodologists talked about like if you really want to make systems that were proactive and would detect things, if you actually look at how people do things ordinarily, they do it in such a mundane way that to expect the system to pick up these ordinary things happening and do stuff for you would be really hard because they just seem so ordinary. And there's nothing saying like, oh, now I'm going to do this action, so you should jump in and I'm going to make this huge gesture or something, right? So it could be that, when talking about the ordinary in this case, right, I think conveying, I think the style works well for ordinary things, with things that happen suddenly and that are kind of vague. So I think kind of in the personal informatics paper that we've been writing a little bit about, we're just thinking about like, how do people think about health and stuff? And it's not always that they write down goals in notebooks and things. And it's they sometimes have like a hazy kind of goals and set of goals, and it's connected to emotions. It might change from one day to another, or some things might remind them walking down the street that they're not making their health goals. And another time they'll walk by and then they'll feel energized to do it. So we felt like that worked well for the Kathleen Stewart style as well, right? So I think, like you're saying, the mundane, ordinary, I think ambiguity, right, which is so much part of what we do actually, and the contingent nature of our activities is something that could be conveyed also with this kind of writing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
And there'll be a final question, and I think we're out of time.
I was wondering what you think it would take for the current ML benchmarks to be turned into something as accessible as a z-score table.
You mean the table to make it more accessible in general, or?
And most stats tables are fairly well known, at least by folks at this level. And the current ML benchmarks, though useful for competition and driving progress forward in terms of accessibility and usability for experimentation, what would it take for the next step on that path of research?
I feel like I would already defer to my computer vision colleagues on this. I'm not sure if I would be the best person to answer that question about it. And I think the path we're going on right now is so heavily benchmarked that, I think the tables will remain a key part of computer vision papers. But maybe I'm not getting your question quite right, so maybe we can talk offline about that.
Sure. Why don't we thank our speaker one more time?